You know, it's a pleasure to come back to Texas A&M after, I guess it's been about 3 years since I've lectured to the group of vet students on ethics. And it's really kind of fun for me to do this because I've had quite a few experiences on my own in dealing with ethical issues as a chemist. And ethics in science is really very, very important, as you are learning, I'm sure. And it sometimes gets in the way of some people's thinking. I'll have a slide about that, and as this one does. But in terms of my own career, I have had a lot of fun in science since I was a student, and came to Texas A&M in the early 80s to try to run the College of Science. And managed to do that for about 9 years, which was very enjoyable for me. But I also was very much interested in not only the research side of chemistry, but the educational side of chemistry. And managed to be involved in the first conference that we had in chemistry that dealt with chemical education, and a marvelous location. Maybe some of you have been in Snowmass in Colorado. It's a great spot. And that set the stage for the next 30 or 40 years of the education that occurred in chemistry. New books were developed, new processes came out of that. And so I was very excited with that. And I also got involved with the Gordon Research Conferences, which are a group of conferences that bring together researchers and educators from all over the world to talk about what's happening. And I managed, in fact, to be involved in the first chemical education Gordon conference in Europe, which was very exciting to me because we had some marvelous speakers several Nobel laureates who spoke to our conference at that particular occasion. But over the last few years, since I've retired, I've had to try to deal with people and learning what science really is. What's the importance? I've talked a little bit with some of these people about the College of Veterinary Medicine because you guys do some things that are fabulous, and this school has really developed marvelously over the last 20, 25 years since I've known Texas A&M. And so it's good to see what's happening and what you people are going to be able to do. But I've been asked to talk about ethics, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my role in that particular area. One of the things that is clear when we talk about ethical relationships in science, that we often get confused a little bit about relationships between scientific ethics and religious ethics. And I happen to believe very strongly the statement of Stephen Gould, a Harvard professor, that indicates that there's really no conflict between scientific thought and religious thought. We just have to realize what those domains are that are covered by the two different approaches. And they're very important approaches, of course. I'm going to tell you about 5 case studies that I got involved with to some degree in the leadership roles I played. There's a very important effort of David Baltimore, who became Nobel Prize winner. Say a few words about that. I got involved with a situation with a distinguished professor at Ohio State. One of the more fun situations I had was dealing with a Nobel laureate student and the ethical questions that were involved there. And then here at Texas A&M, we had a really peculiar situation where one of my colleagues was converting mercury to gold. And the ethical process involved there was interesting and what we did about it. And at Case Western Reserve, when I was younger and department head, actually, I had a case that dealt with a faculty member who actually ended up going to jail. And we'll talk about a little of these things. But we've had some books that relate to these topics that I think you should be aware of. One of them that's been interesting to me is this book Science and Religion in the Fullness of Life, Stephen Gould. He's dead now, but Gould was a marvelous lecturer and faculty member educator at Harvard. Well worth reading. And then there have been a lot of interesting feuds in science. And this book by Hellman is interesting in that regard. It's not moving very fast because the computer's slowed down now on me. But it's loading something, Larry. Don't understand why. But anyway, it should click on to the next book, and I haven't figured out yet what's going to cause it to do that. It's loading an application. Modern technology.
There we go.
Good.
Might just have to hit this.
Yeah. Which one?
Just
The middle one?
either one of them.
Okay. Irving Klotz was a chemist, a physical chemist at Northwestern University who wrote this book on diamond dealers and feather merchants. Some very interesting frauds that he talked about and scientific difficulties. And then this book on bad science related to cold fusion. One of the cases I had to deal with here as dean at A&M. Ethics is kind of important, but it can be a problem. But it's not something that we can just get rid of. It's a factor that we have to consider in all of the dealings with in our scientific activities. But let me say a few words about this whole business of Gould, the relationships between science and religion. One of the interesting things early on in my career was, and I was raised as a Lutheran, and my dad was a minister, and so I got involved quite a bit with what was religious in our particular beliefs. And a lot of people believed certain things about Noah's flood and whether it existed or not. Was it important? And of course, that's something that we understand in terms of our faith relationships, our beliefs. But what was it really? And scientifically, the answers are a little bit different. We can actually make some studies that are scientifically answering questions. And this is particularly true in the evolutionary area. And veterinary medicine has made great progress understanding the concepts of evolution. And yet a lot of people still don't quite accept evolutionary concepts very much. And for those of you who are concerned about that, you might look at this book by Kenneth Miller. Kenneth Miller taught biology actually at Brown, still does. And he wrote some good books. And Francis Collins, who was director of the Genome Project, also is very strong in his faith, but sees no conflict between that and his scientific work. Religion, of course, focuses on beliefs, and those beliefs can have a big impact on our life, of course. And some of the questions that you have to answer is related to those beliefs are whether or not you can actually clone a human and deal with that. And of course, our government has said, no, we can't do that. But I wouldn't be a bit surprised if somebody someday decides to do that. Do we have the right to destroy lives and property when our religious beliefs are verbally or pictorially offended? We've seen a lot of that in the Near East, haven't we, in terms of some destruction of lives and property because of religious concepts. The two domains of religion and science are both equally worthwhile. There's no question about that, and necessary. but they are really logically distinct. And in fact, Gould has this statement, which I find to be quite valuable, that science and religion are very similar and they interdigitate in terms of patterns of complex figuring like fractals, yet they don't overlap in the direct way, and they don't be fused together like some people like to think about them. But it's more like the relationship between a husband and wife, spouses. They don't really fuse in marriage, even though they can interact very, very positively, and hopefully do. Timeliness of actions in ethics are also kind of important. And I'll quickly run through that because you understand that things do change. I mean, we clearly know that the concepts that Galileo ran into with the Catholic Church were rather interesting, but the timeliness of 1625 indicates that, in fact, we have a different view now. Darwin, of course, fought with the religious establishment in Great Britain, and we've changed a lot of the concepts that we understand now with regard to that particular battle. The third thing I put up here, N-rays, is something that I'm sure most of you have never heard of. Back in the late 1900s, there was an individual, Blondin, in France, who'd made an earth-shaking discovery of new rays that were coming in from outer space that were having a big impact on many, many things. This is what he said, anyway. But nobody was able to reproduce those results. Nobody was actually able to test out what this scientist was saying, and in fact, there were no new rays. And then, of course, Margaret Mead's efforts. What is important, nature itself or nurturing activities? And those of you who are studying in veterinary medicine actually have, I'm sure, quite a few contacts dealing with the way in which relationships impact on people as well as the nature itself. But scientific misconduct is defined very clearly by the National Science Foundation. We could ask who is the real authority with regard to ethical issues. It might be the Islamic State, some people. Certainly those people involved with ISIS think it's the Islamic State. The Bible, I'm sure there are people who feel that the Bible is the real authority. The Quran. We in science recognize that the National Science Foundation has some criteria that we can deal with. And misconduct, they say, is anyone who fabricates, falsifies, or plagiarizes, or has some other serious deviation from accepted practices in carrying out, proposing, or reporting research and research activities funded by the NSF. And the cases we're going to be talking about, we're going to ask you really whether or not these features have been violated in any way. Retaliation is another situation that's a little harder to define and deal with, but the Baltimore case, which I'll talk about, is one that does involve retaliation or potential retaliation. And of course, if one is found accused of that, then the National Science Foundation will take action. And these are the actions that they will take. They'll take whatever is appropriate against the individual or the institution, not just the individual. And so this could be very hard on an institution if, in fact, a scientist is found to be involved with misconduct. These rules, we could put our eyes, cover it a little bit, and forget about them. We had a situation that involved Texas A&M a number of years ago that was one in which a lot of administrators wanted to be blinded. They didn't want the blinders on. But you really can't avoid the ethical responsibilities, and the institution itself recognizes that. But who is to really be the judge? You're people studying for advanced degrees and in science-related activity, and you're going to be in a situation to actually be involved in judging what's going on. Science and any new knowledge really follows a timeline and is influenced by decisions with regard to what's happened. State of Kansas a number of years ago had some laws with regard to evolution and creationism in schools. Those things are timely, and they're going to change with time. I grew up at a period of time when Watson and Crick had not yet discovered DNA. If they hadn't been around, somebody would have done it in a little bit of time. Timeliness is important. And then, of course, human cloning is another issue. One of the more important ones that dealt with timeliness was one that we should be worried about, and that's this whole business of nuclear fusion, nuclear fission. And if we hadn't made the discoveries we did during and before the Second World War, I'm sure that the Nazis or somebody would have made those discoveries a little bit later. So timeliness is an issue. Somebody must decide about the use or application of the knowledge. And you people are going to be in that position. You're going to may have to make decisions. Okay, let's look at what we're going to try to deal with in the cases that I've been involved with. We're going to ask, were ethical standards violated? Did society then take an appropriate action in the case that we were dealing with? Did the employer take an appropriate action? Those three questions are involved. And this is the first case I'm going to talk about, the one with David Baltimore. There was in this story, there was a postdoc in Baltimore's group, working with cells, and had made some very interesting discoveries of the insertion of foreign genes into a cell. One of the co-workers in the laboratory, Margaret O'Toole, was also working on the same sort of thing, but didn't believe that Dr. Ashmana Kari's work was really being correct. In fact, Margaret O'Toole thought that Kari's work was fabricated. And so she tried to reproduce it, couldn't reproduce it, and was, as a result, kind of annoyed. And it seemed like she was going to have to tattle on Ashmana Kari. And she did. She complained about the failure of the work to be reproduced. But David Baltimore, who was the leader in the lab, found out, in fact, believed that O'Toole was just jealous of the work of Baltimore's postdoc. And in fact, Baltimore felt that indeed O'Toole was just not capable of handling the work, and they fired her. MIT was involved, and they fired her. This whole thing got into the government through the NIH, which was supporting the work. And the NIH said, maybe there's a problem here with MIT and the handling of O'Toole. And in fact, Senator John Dingell got into the game, and they felt that, in fact, Baltimore, who had by this time moved to Rockefeller University in New York, was in violation of rules of handling research involved with scientific misconduct. And they gave praise to O'Toole. But the problem was that the case had to be looked at very carefully. And as a result of all this effort, though, Congress did set up the Office of Research Integrity to try to deal with questions of scientific misconduct. The new director of the NIH, Bernadine Healy, got involved with the whole process and actually recognized that the postdoc, Shmanakari, had been deprived of her own legal rights in the whole process, which was involved. But it took 10 years, 8 to 10 years, until but there was a formal report, NIH reported, that had said she was guilty as charged of misconduct. Well, this was appealed. Baltimore was certainly involved, but Baltimore had to give up his job at Rockefeller University because there was just so much going on with regard to the decisions. And Bernadine Healy actually was able for the first time to get a legitimate hearing done in which the accusers of Shmanakari were actually confronted with this whole thing and cross-examined and found out that she was not guilty. They gave her a ringing verdict of innocence. What did this do? Well, it condemned the NIH funding, so there were problems, obviously. And so there was a problem in the Secret Service finding information in Shmanakari's books that was really not there. And this seemingly was done under pressure from the Senator Dingell. Shmanakari, fortunately, became tenured at Tufts, and so she came out of this all right. Baltimore himself then went on to become president at Caltech, and so he survived quite well in this whole process, and it became AAAS president and chaired biology department at Caltech. So it's a kind of an interesting, very muddled and very difficult story. But let's ask the three questions that I asked. Were ethical standards really violated in this whole thing? What's your thoughts about that? Well, I'll let you think about that. Did society take the appropriate action? Well, what about all this effort of the NIH to get into it and the Senator Dingell getting involved? Is that appropriate? It's tough to answer that, isn't it? How about MIT and firing O'Toole over this whole issue of O'Toole sort of condemning her colleague? Did MIT take the right action in firing her? Boy, that's a tough one, isn't it? O'Toole really was not able to reproduce the results of her colleague, but was it her fault, or was it her colleague Shmanakari's fault that the results couldn't be reproduced? Yes?
Why did they fire her? Like, what, couldn't someone else also?
Well, they fired her because Baltimore felt she was incompetent and unable to really do the research. That was the basis he used for that process.
No one else tried to?
Oh yeah, it was actually reproduced in Baltimore's laboratory by other people. Yeah. You don't always know that, by the way, and one of the cases I'll talk about is a group of people who did an inquiry that really couldn't tell whether mercury could produce gold in a particular process. Okay, how about the Ohio State situation? This was one when I was teaching at Case Western Reserve. It got kind of interesting. A faculty member at University of Texas submitted a research proposal. And that research proposal, which is customary, went to a peer somewhere out there. In this case, it went to this faculty member at Ohio State who studied the proposal and actually let his postdoc take a look at the proposal too. Postdoc was producing research in a very similar area, and the faculty member at Ohio State and the postdoc published a paper in which work closely related to that in the proposal was published, including some sentences that were directly out of the proposal and typos that were in the proposal. So it was very clear that there was some sort of funny business occurring. The faculty member at University of Texas recognized that problem and actually asked the agency that was supporting the work to look into this a little bit further. And the Ohio State faculty member claimed he was really innocent of any problems. And the Ohio State did an investigation then too, had a committee to look at it. And they found that the faculty member was perhaps not as careful as he should have been, but was not really undergoing any scientific misconduct in the process. But the government actually looked into this carefully enough to recognize that the faculty member had been negligent. And what the NSF did in this particular case was denied this faculty member research support for 3 years. The faculty member had other research funding, and the university kept him active in various ways, and he continued on his research activity. And he really blamed everything on the postdoc. Postdoc had screwed up, but he denied any plagiarism for this particular activity. So think about the three questions then. Were ethical standards violated? How many of you think that some ethical standards were in fact violated? Yeah, a few of you do. Good. Did the society itself, did Ohio State, for example, take appropriate action, or did NSF take appropriate action in this?
What happened to the postdoc?
The postdoc finished up his work and went on and got a job. Was not, in fact, was left out of the picture, in fact. And the employer, Ohio State, didn't do anything special other than set up this committee that dealt with that. Was that appropriate? Not very harsh, certainly. But this faculty member was a member of the National Academy of Sciences, too. So it meant a lot of money for the research program at Ohio State. And I'm sure that played a role with some of the thinking of the institution itself. This particular case of a Stanford professor in the 1960s came to my attention because I was department head when the student who was involved with the work came up for tenure at one of the Midwestern universities. This faculty member, who ultimately got the Nobel Prize, was believing that electron transfer through molecules occurred in a very specific way. And this graduate student was then set on the task of trying to discover how electron transfer actually occurs in molecules. And this graduate student did a beautiful job in that because he found positive results. Results that really fitted very beautifully in the imagination and ideas of his research supervisor. And he published his thesis and a couple of papers, one particularly important paper with regard to this whole thing. Faculty member was good, obviously, took a position at this Midwestern university that I said I got involved with regard to his tenure case. Well, 6, 7 years later, he came up for tenure, but a young man up in Canada actually tried to reproduce the work that was in this thesis and found that that was impossible. He just tried very hard to do that and questioned the faculty member at Stanford about whether or not this research was really correct. And what did the faculty member at Stanford do? Well, set up a situation where at least somebody else in his laboratory would try to reproduce the work. And he did that, in fact. And the work that was published in the thesis could not be reproduced. And he didn't do that only with one postdoc, he did it with a couple. And he was pretty certain then that there's something peculiar had happened. He confronted the person who was up for tenure at this Midwestern university, and in fact, this person confessed that in fact he had fabricated the data in his thesis. Well, no, needless to say, this gentleman did not get tenure at the Midwestern University. But the work could not be reproduced that was in the thesis. The work went, the idea though, that was involved was such that in fact this faculty member was able to develop other procedures that in fact did point out the way in which electrons are moving through molecules. And as a result of that, the faculty member got the Nobel Prize. The student, the papers of this student had to be withdrawn, and they were. And as I said, the former student resigned and he left the country. His home country was New Zealand, and he went back to New Zealand, where he ended up no longer doing research. So it was an interesting case, and I was involved with it because I was asked to evaluate the person's achievements when he was being considered for tenure. Think we did the right things in terms of decision making? Were there ethical standards that were violated? Well, if you fabricate your thesis, that's pretty clear, isn't it? You've violated one of the standards that's there. Did appropriate action get taken? Well, it took a while. Certainly this gentleman did not get tenure at the institution that he was hoping to get tenure at. And I guess the employer did take appropriate action in the process. Here's a local one. We had a distinguished professor that had been working in the area of cold fusion. Some of you have probably read about cold fusion and what was involved with that. We had been working in this area, but came across a gentleman by the name of Joe Champion, who was able to get some money for a cold fusion type of experiment in which one takes mercury salts, puts them in a can with some other components, fuses this material together under high temperature conditions, and out comes gold from this mixture. At least this is what Champion had said. So this faculty member at A&M said, okay, we're going to reproduce this cold fusion type of activity. And in fact, I was on sabbatical leave in '92, came back to Texas A&M, and this particular distinguished professor came to me with a little gold nugget, which he claimed he had gotten from the mercury in Joe Champion's process. It was kind of interesting, since I had been an expert in gold chemistry. I asked him very pointedly, did he have the material isotopically analyzed? Because there's only one gold isotope, and mercury has 5. And so, gosh, if it's coming from mercury, what's happening? All 5 isotopes of mercury involved? Well, when I asked him this, he said that he didn't want to do the experiment that would test that particular question. But he did go down to Mexico City and raise money for his research. And in fact, he claimed that indeed he hadn't done this, but there were pictures in the newspapers with him talking to some of the people who might be able to give him funding for the research. That was really kind of a blow to Texas A&M, needless to say, to have this sort of thing happen. Publicity of the type we didn't really want. It turns out some of the fundraisers were jailed because of the lies that were involved with their activity. And the university decided then to impound the distinguished professor's research funds. But we had a committee that was set up then that looked at the details of whether that we should fire the faculty member, a distinguished professor, defrock him. And the committee decided, no, that shouldn't be the case. There were no grounds for dismissal. faculty member eventually retired. The department head was very good, was able to get the faculty member to retire in a very short period of a couple of years. And the faculty in chemistry decided that in retirement they would not even give this gentleman a emeritus status, which is kind of peculiar at a place like Texas A&M, especially for a distinguished professor. Turns out that Houston Chronicle had a marvelous one-page article about this Aggie alchemy, the creation of gold from mercury. And this whole story of John Bockris became a real laughing story for a lot of people in Texas. But there were people who still believed that mercury could be converted into gold. And in fact, this gentleman, Malev, talked about in a book the whole business of cold fusion and the fusion that led to from mercury to gold. And some people believed it, but the results of the study really clearly indicate that that was not the situation. Did we, as at Texas A&M, first of all, were ethical standards violated in this whole process? It's a little difficult to deal with the ethical standards. This question of doing a laboratory experiment that somebody else had originally developed, Joe Champion, and converting a mercury into gold, is that really violating ethics? Well, if he fabricated the results, it is. And indeed, if the gold that was produced in this process, so-called gold produced in this process, really was fabricated, then of course it would be true. It's difficult to know for sure. As you know, as those of you who studied history recognize that a lot of mercury was dumped into the Gulf when the Spaniards were getting gold from South America, because mercury dissolves gold. And the mercury that is in barrels that from ships that were destroyed in hurricanes and other things that ended up in the bottom of the Gulf, a lot of that mercury still has residual amounts of gold in it. And so it's conceivable that the mercury that was being used by Joe Champion was actually mercury that contained gold, enough gold, so that when the mercury is boiled off, there's a residual amount of gold remained. That's a theory. It's never been tested. I think you have to come up with enough mercury from galleons of the Spaniards that were sunk in the Gulf to really test this someday. And somebody might do that. But in fact, the reality is there is gold in that mercury. There's no question about that. Did our society take appropriate action with regard to this gentleman, John Bockris? Well, we didn't take much action. We just set up a committee and dealt with it. How about A&M itself? Well, I think the faculty in chemistry did the right thing. This guy had done something that really shouldn't have been done in science and fabricated really the thinking with regard to producing gold from mercury. Not giving him an emeritus status, I think, was quite appropriate. One that I got involved with as a department head in 1973 was a troubling one for me. A good friend of mine, actually, in our faculty, was on leave. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, this phone call came to me. I was actually in bed. And the phone call came from California telling me that my colleague had been pleaded guilty of perjury in a court case involving the manufacture of LSD. He was a consultant in the area of, as a good organic chemist, of manufacturing LSD and making some money doing that in California. I hadn't been aware of that activity as department head, but I had seen his expenses is traveling, and I knew he was going to California, traveling from Europe during his leave time. But he ended up after he pled guilty of getting a 6-month jail sentence at a federal penitentiary. Kind of a nice jail sentence for him it was, because he still had a typewriter and computer capabilities there, but he was jailed. They had determined that he had been a consultant in this area of illicit manufacture of LSD. So what did we do at the university? Well, the university set up a panel, which it always does in cases like this. Tried to examine whether or not dismissal should be pursued over this faculty member. Should he still be allowed to be doing research and teaching? Faculty member didn't want to resign after he came out of jail. He didn't want to resign. So this decision had to be one in which the university really evaluated the case very strongly. And we had a lawyer who was present at the time at Case Western Reserve. So that was kind of interesting to see it. It took a long time. Took 6 months of various appealing and dealing with it. But tenure was, a faculty member was actually denied staying at the university and was dismissed. He moved to California, had a new wife. He had divorced his wife. He got a new wife who was his secretary, actually. And I saw him once in a while at various chemistry meetings. I usually tried to avoid him as much as I could, but it happened I did see him. What were the ethical standards and were they violated in this case? Is it ethically correct for me to give my ability as a consultant in the manufacture of an illicit substance? Probably not, huh? Especially if it's violating the law. Society took appropriate action. Well, the government actually got him to agree that he had lied, perjury. That was appropriate action, going to jail for that. How about Case Western Reserve? Did we take appropriate action? What do you think? Most of you think, yeah, probably get rid of him, huh? And we did. Let me ask a couple of questions that relate to this. Does the admission of guilt and asking for forgiveness play a role in the ethics of science? Certainly, you make a mistake and you ask for forgiveness. But if you've plagiarized somebody's work or if you've reported results that are incorrect, falsified, as an individual, you can say, oh, gee, I'm sorry for this. But should it play a role in the decision-making process? What is forgivable and what is not forgivable? You got to think of the impact that that decision might make on future information, future students, future people. Is it good or is it bad? What determines it? Or respect for people. If I, as a distinguished professor, do something, is that worse or better than assistant professor doing a particular thing? Unfortunately, those are issues that do play a role, I'm sure, because we're humans. We go through these sorts of processes. But you have to really think it through yourself. As people who are going to get involved in these sorts of processes in the future, you must develop your own intelligent answers to these sorts of questions that come up. Hopefully you won't be stuck with the sorts of things that I had to deal with as department head and as dean. They were pretty troublesome to me, and in fact, I'm sure I lost some sleep over several of them. Case of John Bockris, the one here at Texas A&M, haunted us for a number of years, in fact. It included, and this is what makes it so difficult to deal with, it included a graduate student who had worked in the area And we had to set up a separate committee for his PhD activity, which we were able to do. We did that very nicely, I think, and handled it, brought in 2 people from the outside to really deal with it. And the cold fusion part of his thesis was left as an appendix. It was not part of the important activity that led to the PhD for the student. That had to be developed. But thinking about this, you're going to deal with these sorts of issues, and you have to ask yourself what really makes a difference in the whole process. And I like this little cartoon because the starfish is being looked at. What you're doing really make a difference? Well, it certainly does to the starfish. So we have to think about that in the process. Anyway, these are the sorts of stories that I got involved with as an administrator and a teacher over the number of years I was involved with my activity. I'd be happy to try to answer or deal with any questions you might have that I've perhaps stimulated in our discussion. So thank you very much.